Hey everybody, this is Tony Cottasponti from GreatVocalMajority.com, and today I'm going to talk about the Bureau of Labor Statistics Employment Situation Summary for the month of December, which came out yesterday, that is on Friday, the 2nd of October. So let's get right into it, okay? Here are some of the highlights. Now, at the outset, let's just state the obvious. This was not a good report. The weakness of the employment market is going to give the Fed pause about the timing of interest rate increases. There are a few bright spots, just a few, and while U3 was unchanged, U3 being the official unemployment rate, that measure is beginning to fade in relevance, which will be demonstrated later in this presentation. The U6 rate is down in the month, and that is one of the few bright spots. But whatever good news was in those numbers was more than offset by declines in work hours, wages, and the workforce participation rate, which is now at a 38-year low. So let's look into some of the details of the highlights. For the month, 142,000 jobs were created, which was well below the estimates, which were about 75,000 jobs more than that. And prior months were revised downward by $59,000. As I mentioned earlier, the U3 unemployment rate remained unchanged from August and has gone down about 0.4 of a point since May, and I'll get into a discussion of that later. As you can see on the industrial side, most of the jobs were created in about 4 or 5 different industries. Retail, trade, then you have the professional and business services sector, education and health services, which has been very strong, and of course that's going to be strong because of the health care law, among other things. Then there's leisure and hospitality, and unfortunately, government also grew, and that was where you got your 142,000 jobs for the month. Looking across here to the demographics on the unemployment rate itself by age and gender and race, really not a whole lot to report. There's a lot of fluctuation in the black unemployment rate. It's been as low as 9.1. It bounced up to 9.5 last month. It's back down to 9.2 this month. And that's really the only news there. This is a headlight, or what I call a red light, green light chart that basically summarizes a lot of things that are contained within the Bureau of Labor Statistics report. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics takes 2 surveys each month, and the results of those surveys are interwoven into their report, the report that they publish and release. Here on this chart, I've noted which survey contains the information listed. So if you look over here, I'll point to it. You see a little HS. Most of these are HS, meaning it's the household survey. ES is the establishment survey. The establishment survey is what is used to give us the information on the number of jobs created. The household survey is where the unemployment rate comes from. In another video, I'll talk about how those 2 surveys are done and their strengths and shortcomings in each of them. Now, the number of jobs, as I told you, comes from the establishment survey, and the rate of unemployment comes from the household survey. In this particular chart, only the average weekly hours and earnings come from the establishment survey. Now, that said, total employment actually declined in the month by 236,000 jobs. You see that number up here in red. And of course, anything you see in red is in red because it's denoted as bad, and anything in green is considered good. Anything in yellow is neither good nor bad. It's ambivalent. So we lost 236,000 people that were employed in the month. The total employment declined. it's now where it was, pretty close to where it was in May. If you notice here, we had 148,795,000 people employed in May. Now just 5,000 more, 148,800,000. Now, this is rather significant because it's generally assumed that the U.S. population grows at roughly 200,000 people a month. Sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less. You might ask, how could employment go down without any change in the unemployment rate? That's a good question, and we're going to get into that. Now, there are several factors which I'll show you in the next chart, but first, let me point out some important things to note on this chart. Beside the total employment number, barely changing since May, we should also note that the number of people reported as unemployed has declined by 795,000 since May. That's this 8,674,000 going to 7,915,000. That's a decline of 759,000 people. Well, if we declined in unemployment by 759,000 and we also declined in employment, where did those 759,000 people go? This would be good news if we could say that those people got jobs and are now employed, but it's hard to make that case since employment itself barely changed since May, 5,000, and in the month went down 236,000. So what happened to all those people? The answer is somewhere else, and we're going to get into that. Now, I want you to also look at the number who are not in the workforce. That number has gone up. This number here went from 92,986,000 to 94,610,000. That's an increase from May by about 1.6 million, and in the month, 579,000. Some people are probably retirees, to be fair, and some are probably out on disability, but not all of them. Now, using the workforce status flow reports that the BLS also publishes separately from their employment situation report, that can tell us for any given month the number of people who began the period in one category, for example, employed, and ended the period out of the workforce. Now, if you were employed at the beginning of a month, but out of the workforce by the end of the month, it's reasonable to assume that you either retired or something happened to you on the job and you were disabled. So that's who's included in that category. The BLS can also tell us how many people began any given month in the unemployed category and then ended up at the end of the period was out of the workforce. Now, if you think about it, what kind of person would be inclined to leave the workforce if they were unemployed? Those would be people who gave up looking for jobs. Because if you're unemployed, you're either going to be in the unemployed category at the beginning and the end of the period. You're going to begin the period in unemployed and find a job, in which case you'll be in the employed category, or you will leave the workforce, give up looking for a job, and be not in the labor force anymore. Those people are called discouraged workers. And now we can go on to the next chart to show you some more about how this all works. Now, remember how U3 is calculated. U3 is essentially the number of unemployed people, right here, number of unemployed, divided by what's called the workforce. And the workforce is really just the combination of the people who are unemployed and the people who are employed. Now, why do we include only those people in the workforce? Why don't we include everybody who's available to work? Well, because the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics looks at this, they define the workforce as people who are either working or looking for work. If you're out of the workforce and no longer looking for work, you are technically unemployed, but you are not part of the workforce because you're not looking for work. Okay, now remember that this is how the unemployment rate is calculated. And in May, the number of people was roughly equal to what it was in September. I have August here, but this should really be September. Okay, so you see that the number of employed people only increased by 5,000. But the number of unemployed went down by 759,000. And that's why the unemployment rate fell from 5.5% to 5.1%. The number of people who were unemployed went down. But where did they go? Because they didn't get jobs. It's hard to fit 759,000 into 5,000. So how did that happen? Most of those 759,000 didn't get jobs. Most left the workforce altogether because the number of people out of the workforce increased. Look at this number down here. The number of people who left the workforce between May and September increased by 1,624,000 people. That's a very big number. So you had a total increase in the population of 870,000. Remember what I said earlier about how the population tends to grow approximately, roughly speaking, about 200,000 people a month? Well, 870,000 is not quite 200,000 people a month, but it's close. It would have to be around 950,000 to be closer to 200,000 people a month. But in any event, you see the point. The point is, as the population grows, you would expect the rate and pace of the growth here to be matched by the employment, or maybe even exceeded, so that we would be able to truly eat into the number of people who aren't working that want to work. Anyway, question is, a lot of people will say, well, this number increased here, this 1,624,000, that's not people leaving the workforce. That's also people who are retiring. That's true. It is people who are retiring, and as well as people leaving the workforce because they're discouraged. But do we know how that breaks down? Is there a way to look at this where we could say, this is how many are leaving the workforce proportionally? How many people are leaving the workforce versus how many people are retiring or on disability? Let's take a look at the next chart and see if that can help us out. Now this chart, I've plotted people who are retiring versus people who are discouraged from looking for a job. In order to get this information, people who've left the workforce at the end of the month but began the month employed, I classified as retirees, retired people. Anyone who began the month unemployed and ended it out of the workforce, I classified as discouraged worker. It's possible that you could have other people included in those two categories, but I would argue that the overwhelming majority of the people in those categories are as I described. And the reason why I won't get hung up on the nits and lice of the other things that could be in there is because I don't think that would change if that information even were available, that it would change what this chart looks like in any material way. So let's try to understand what we're looking at here. Let's first examine the red line for retirees. That's this line here. Okay? During the late 1990s, we had the first wave of retirees that were the baby boomers. That's when they began to retire, the very first ones. And the monthly number increased to about 3.5 to 4 million. I mean, it was in that range. Here's 3.5 million, here's 4 million. And you can see from about the late 1990s all the way up through here. Even up, you can even say as late as here. those numbers were pretty much, that's where they stabilized, between 3.5 and 4 million after starting below. Okay? Beginning in 2010, the slope began to curve upward again. That's here. This is when this right here is when the baby boomers started to retire in larger numbers. But note, the increase has been gradual. It didn't shoot up. It's slowly increasing. I mean, this number varies a lot, if you notice. From month to month, it goes up, it goes down. Look at this right here, it's up and down. It varies a lot. But if you just kind of figure a midway path through this line, through this channel, you can see that the slope is up, but it's not steeply up. And that makes sense when you consider the aging population of the baby boomers retiring. And also keep in mind the numbers here. That's about 3.5 to 4 million. Now you're talking about 1 million more than that, about 4.5 million. Okay? So then you look down here. This blue line. This is discouraged workers. The first thing you'll notice about this line is how it's marked by much less month-to-month variability. See how this wide swings? These down here, they don't swing that wide. So, and if you look from beginning in 1995 all the way to right about here, the range was between about 1,500,000 to 2 million a month. So you had about 1.5 million to 2 million people a month becoming discouraged from looking for work. Now these numbers sound large, but you have to remember, we're talking about mass movements. We're talking about people who are unemployed, looking for work, discouraged, and stop looking. What I haven't put on this chart is that there are also people who are leaving the not in the workforce and they're moving back into the workforce and they become unemployed because they're looking for work. But what we're trying to isolate here is when we look at the growth of the number of people that are not in the workforce, where is it coming from? What is it comprised of? And so what you see here is that we had this very relatively narrow range of people who were discouraged until here, which is about the time the recession began to crop up. Remember, the recession didn't begin, it began when, we started to see people losing their jobs. We didn't know we were in a recession until late 2008, but before that, people began losing their jobs. And so they started looking for work. They had trouble finding it because companies were, pulling in their reins. And that's when you get up to this higher level. I didn't want to do that. I'm going to go back. There we go. So that's when you get up to this higher level here. So when you take a look at this increase, notice how steep it is. That's a recession. That's people looking for work, not finding work, and disgusted, stopping looking. But the recession ended in 2009. Obama was inaugurated right here. The recession ended right about here. If this was a normal recession, this line here should be coming down as fast as it went up. But if you notice, it's a protracted decline. And that protracted decline is very important to understand because that is the change that's happened in the economy. Keep in mind, the people, as these people are, what this line represents, just keep in mind what that line represents. It represents people stopping looking for work. So what you're seeing here is a slow, gradual decline in the millions of people who are leaving the workforce each month because they're unable to find work. If this were normal, again, like I said earlier, it would go down more sharply. The fact that it's going like this and it's more protracted over time indicates that there's going to be a buildup of people who are not in the workforce that would work if they thought work was available. So what essentially happened is this. In the Great Recession, at least 6 to 8 million people left the workforce discouraged from looking for work. In the intervening years, that's the gradual slope that you see there. That's the economic recovery. Many have returned to the workforce, but almost as many have also become discouraged. So you got to picture this as almost like a revolving door, where you have more people going into the building called not in the labor force than there are coming out into the street called labor force street. So that's what's happening. You're getting more people coming in, and they're just kind of building up inside this not in the labor force group. Now that means we have more discouraged workers sitting on the sidelines than at any other point in our recent history. But it's being masked by the fact that we used the U3 unemployment rate, which does not account for all of these discouraged workers. So it just looks at employed versus the people who are actually working and unemployed. And it doesn't account at all for all of these people who have just given up looking for work. So it really masks how bad the unemployment situation truly is. Now, I want to do an exercise here that will help us understand what the real unemployment rate is. And there are a lot of ways to do this, but this is one of my favorite ways because I think it's easy to understand. And I'll go through it slowly because there's some numbers involved, but it's not very difficult to absorb. And what you basically do is you look at 2009, when Barack Obama's first full month in office. The workforce participation rate was 65.8%. Okay? And then we look at the workforce participation rate now in September. It's 62.4%. Now that's just a decline of 3.4 points, and it may not seem like a lot. But you have to remember, the total population we're talking about here is over 200 million people. So 3% is millions of people. All right? So, and some of that decline people will attribute to retirees. And you saw on one of the previous charts that there are more retirees than people who are discouraged each month leaving the workforce. So this is weighted towards retirees. Absolutely. But the number of people who are discouraged is more than it's ever been. That's what's not really being discussed in policy circles. So let's assume something in just for this analysis. And here's what we'll assume. Don't be intimidated by this because it's actually really very simple. The reported numbers for the adult population and the total number of people employed in this exercise will not be changed. Okay? They're going to be as whatever the BLS reported them to be. Now that's a standard practice in variance analysis. And here's why. In variance analysis, what you do, you have a situation where you have a number of variables. And what you do is you hold constant all the variables but one. And then you just kind of mess with that one variable and you use different numbers just to see how does the overall result change by changing that one variable. because that will tell you how much that variable affects the total outcome. Okay? Now, what are the variables? We'll get into that. So here's September 2015. The number of people employed is 148,800,000. That is exactly as the BLS reported it. Okay? Then we go to the total number of people in the adult population. Okay? So these are the two givens that we have. These are the things that will not change. These are the reported numbers. The number of people, 251,325,000, is the adult population, working age, working capable age in the United States. Okay? Now, remember what we said. We have 65.8 is the workforce participation rate. We're going to assume, what would everything look like if we still had that same participation rate that we had in February 2009? So what we'll do is we're going to calculate what the workforce would look like by taking 251,325 and multiply it by 65.8. And that'll give us a workforce of 165,372,000 people. Okay, now remember what we said a few moments ago about how we calculate the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is essentially the number of people employed and the number of people unemployed divided by the total number of people in the workforce. So what we can do is we could just say take 148,800 away from this 165,372, and that will give us the number of people who are unemployed using the workforce participation rate of 65.8%. You understand what I did there? I basically just said, okay, here's what we know for September. 148 million employed, total population 251 million. If we use the workforce participation rate of 65.8, we would apply that percentage against the population to get this number, and then it's just deduction to get to the unemployed number. Now, if we have the number of people employed, we have the number of people unemployed, and we have the total workforce, which is just the addition of those two, calculated, and we have the total population, the only thing left to calculate are the people not in the labor force, which would, similar to the unemployed number, would just be taking 165,000 from 251,000. And when we do that, we get 85,953. Okay? So what's this telling me? Well, this is telling me that if we had a 65.8 workforce participation rate, we'd have, instead of having what was the number of unemployed? 7,915,000. Instead of having 7,915,000 people unemployed, we'd have 16,572,000 people unemployed. This number here. Okay? That's what that's telling me. Now, how can we make those assumptions? Well, the reason why here's something else to also consider. The reason why we use 148,000, the reported number, and the reported number for the population is because that is the truth. That is what it is. And we know the number of people that are employed. That is what it is. But what we always get stuck measuring are these numbers, the unemployed people and the people not in the workforce. Those are the numbers that are harder to get at. So we take what we know, and then we try to back into what we don't know using the old participation rate to say, suppose the participation rate didn't change since Obama's been president. What would this unemployment number look like? Now, obviously, one of the shortcomings of this analysis is that the participation rate would very likely have changed since Obama's been president under any conditions, even under the best conditions, with more and more people retiring, we could have expected to see a lower participation rate than this. Certainly, though, higher than this. So where's the right answer? Well, the right answer's got to be somewhere in between. But I'm not going to try to give you that answer. I just want you to realize that not every piece of analysis is bulletproof. It's a lot of estimating and it's a lot of guessing, but it's educated guessing. And using that educated guesswork, we would have a recalculated unemployment rate using the 2009 workforce participation rate. And here's what it would be. It would be 10%. In other words, it would essentially be twice as high as it is now. And to be honest, that makes sense. Because if you take a look at the number of people who are in the category not in labor force, it would seem to say that there are about 8 million people. Now, if you want to really, that's a worst case scenario. If you wanted to say, well, some of this decline would have to be due to retirees. Now, on a previous chart, if we go back to the previous chart, sorry, I can't do this the right way, but if you go back to the previous chart and you look over here and you see 4.5 million and 2 million, so that's about 6.5 million, right? So you would say, well, about 2/3 of people leaving the workforce are retirees, and 1/3 are discouraged. Okay, that's fine. If you want to look at it that way, fine. You can then say that 2/3 of this decline is due to retirees, and this number would only go down maybe 1.2 points. In which case the unemployment rate would still be a lot higher than it is here, maybe not, maybe around 7%, right? The point being, there's a lot of people who are not in the labor force, and they're not in the labor force because they're discouraged, and the metric that we use to measure unemployment doesn't help us see that. Politicians, though, love it because it gives a picture that's better than it actually is. But not everything in the BLS report is what we need to know. There are other reports that the BLS does produce that are not in their monthly report. They are released at a different time. And one of them is called the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, JOLTS. And here are a couple highlights from the most recent report. Now, what this chart shows are the number of job openings. These are unfilled jobs. And the number is higher than it's ever been. Now, this measurement has only been in place since the year 2000. So there's not a lot of history on it, just 15 years worth of history. But in those 15 years, this is the highest that number's ever been, 5.8 million. Now, keep in mind, these are jobs that could be full-time jobs, they could be part-time jobs, they could be bad-paying jobs, they could be lousy jobs, but they're jobs. They are jobs, they are available, they're open, and they're unfilled. So there is work available. Now, where this work is available and what kind of jobs, that information is not included in the JOLTS report. But I wanted to include this to show people that this isn't all negative. Some positive information is contained within the the labor market surveys that the BLS does. There's one more chart I want to do before I quit on this presentation. Here's another optimistic sign. This is the rate of job openings. Kind of goes along with the same thing that you saw on the previous chart, the number of job openings. But this is the rate of job openings, which is, of course, related. The rate means if you look at the number of jobs and the number of job openings, that's a percentage, right? So this is just a percentage of that. And it mirrors what you saw on the previous chart. But again here, this is the highest it's ever been since they've been keeping records on it. And that's a good thing. So there are hopeful signs. And we just got to hope that the policymakers do the right things to encourage businesses to hire. Because what we have, obviously, here is we got 5.8 million jobs. There's more than that number of people out of work. And if you include the number of people who are not in the labor force, you're talking about as many as 15 or 16 million people who are looking for jobs, and we only have 5.8 million available. Moreover, what we also don't know are the quality of these jobs, as I mentioned. So we don't know if these are part-time jobs or what, minimum wage jobs. We don't know. So that's what I want to leave you with. That's the end of my analysis of the Bureau of Labor Statistics report. I hope you got something out of it. You can come to my website, greatvocalmajority.com. There's a lot of information there. I have a lot of videos on economics and politics. There's a lot of news feeds from all over the world. There's also a podcast. And it's really just there for people to become more educated and aware of what's going on. I'm trying to explain things that average people may have difficulty understanding because either the media doesn't cover it or it's covered in a way that's too technical, and I'm just trying to make it easier. And if you have any suggestions, you can always drop me a line at greatvocalmajority.com. I appreciate any feedback. And that's basically it. Thanks a lot.